Hello, I'm Cheryl Morgan, and it gives me great pleasure to introduce Kim Stanley Robinson to Bristol Ideas. You'll hear more about his latest science fiction novel shortly, but I'm here to tell you how he became a giant of the field. In doing this, I'm indebted, as is often the case, to our mutual friend John Clute, whose online encyclopedia of science fiction is an invaluable resource on the history of the genre. Stan, as he's known to his friends, got his start in science fiction while still at university. Dr. Robinson, to give him his academic title, wrote his PhD thesis on the novels of Philip K. Dick. His supervisor was the legendary Marxist literary critic Frederick Jameson. Like so many writers, Stan began his publishing career with short fiction, and it was perhaps a harbinger of things to come that one of his earliest successful pieces was Venice Drowned, set in a future where the city of canals is mostly underwater. Unusually, his first critical success was with a fantasy story, Black Air, which won the World Fantasy Award in 1984. Meanwhile, Stan was working on novels, and when they came, they were an immediate success. His first books, the Three Californias trilogy, garnered a couple more award wins and established Stan's reputation for fascinating political thought experiments. Stan burst onto the world stage with the publication of Red Mars in 1992. This meticulously researched novel looks at what it would actually take for humans to colonize the Red Planet. Red Mars won the Nebula Award, and the successors, Green Mars and Blue Mars, both won the Hugo. While Red Mars focuses on the practical issues of initial colonization, the trilogy progresses to look at how Mars might be terraformed to make it more amenable to human habitation and the ethics of doing so. Inevitably, the Martian colonists rebel and set up their own government, and this allows Stan to engage in more political thought experiments. Never one to settle into a rut, Stan followed this hugely successful series with two standalone novels. Antarctica, as the name suggests, looks at life in one of the most forbidding places on Earth, while The Years of Rice and Salt is an alternate history based on the idea that the Black Death wiped out European civilization, leaving the world to Asian cultures. Next up for Stan, beginning in 2005, was his first major look at issues of climate change. The Science in the Capital trilogy looks at how US government scientists and politicians struggle to preserve civilization in a world in which the Gulf Stream has stopped flowing and sea level has risen significantly. The knowledge of how government departments work that informed this series has clearly been carried over on a global scale to the Ministry for the Future. The early 2010s saw more experiments. A particular favorite book of mine is 2312, in which humanity has colonized much of the solar system. One of the social changes in the book is that people with certain intersex traits have been shown to live much longer than males or females. As a result, rich families all over the world have rushed to have their children genetically engineered to be intersex, and gender diversity has become fashionable. The diversity of Stan's range as an author is illustrated by his next two novels. Shaman from 2013 is a coming-of-age story about a Paleolithic artist. Aurora from 2016 is far future science fiction that takes an in-depth look at the popular trope of the Generation Starship, in which voyages to the stars take place over hundreds of years and many generations. 2017 saw a return to themes of climate change. In New York 2140, Stan imagines a world in which sea level has risen by 50 feet. Much of New York is underwater, but the upper floors of skyscrapers are still inhabitable. The people of New York, indomitable as ever, manage to find new ways of living in this Venice of the Americas. This is very much a book in which small communities try to cope with life after a climate catastrophe. But now we come to the Ministry for the Future, in which Stan once again asks what can actually be done on a global scale to prevent that catastrophe from happening. Few other science fiction writers have spent so much time thinking about the problems the world faces in the near future and trying to find practical ways to overcome them. Now here are Andrew Kelly and Stan to tell you more about the book.
Well, thank you very much, Cheryl, and thank you for joining us, Stan. It's a great pleasure to have you with us and to be talking with you today. I wanted to start by your inspiration for the Ministry for the Future. When did you have this idea, and what's the background to this?
Well, thank you for that, and thank you to Cheryl for that kind introduction. As far as I can recall, the ideas for Ministry for the Future came to me in a kind of a flurry around 2018, and I wrote the book in 2019, which now seems like an awfully long time ago across some geological divide. What struck me the most, and it's the reason it's the first scene in the book, is the news coming out of the scientific literature that essentially was coalesced across a couple of different fronts. It was as if it was already known but hadn't yet been remarked upon, that at a certain combination of high heat and high humidity, the human body cannot survive, so that hyperthermia is just as dangerous as hypothermia, and within hours, people die. And you could be, I read this, you could be naked in the shade with a fan on you and evaporative cooling not working, you would still in that situation die. Nothing but air conditioning would keep you alive. And air conditioning requires electricity, and electrical grids often fail under moments of high demand like this would be. So that I found terrifying and under discussed. So I thought, if this is the case, then broad swaths of the inhabited world will become uninhabitable, or inhabitable only by the luck of electrical grids working. And I wanted to write about that. And this is just like one signal, maybe a canary in the coal mine type signal of a larger biosphere collapse that we are creating, the beginning of the sixth great mass extinction event that is anthropogenic, and one signal of the Anthropocene, that we are the major geological force right now, and we're creating an eco disaster, a biosphere collapse that will inevitably drag us down too. That needed, it just struck me that I needed to try to write about that. How could we squeak out of that situation that we're in now? Could I write a kind of best case scenario that you could still believe in? And being a utopian science fiction writer, which I have been now for maybe 30 years, could the new low bar definition of utopia be that we get through this century without a mass extinction event? And so there you get Ministry.
Yeah. Now, one of the things that is really impressive in this incredibly impressive book is the way you've rooted it, not just in the science, but also in debates about economics, about population, about extinction, about money, and how that leads you on to some of the solutions, which I want to come back to. But I wondered about these kind of burgeoning initiatives like the Welsh Future Generations people. Funny enough, when I heard about your book for the first time, we were doing an event with some of the people from that office, and I said, you really must read this novel as well. Now, you may have only heard of these from after you'd written about it, but what do you think about that kind of work taking place?
Yes, well, it's one of the strands that I looked into while trying to research the novel, because I would like to say that I'm not an ideas person, more like a reporter. I would say very few of my ideas are original to me. A novelist I regard as something like the telephone operator in the old 1940s movies, plugging in one voice and then plugging in another voice. These are other people's voices. And so I saw that there is indeed movements, the Children's Trust, the Ministry for the Future in Wales. I did an event with Jane Davidson, who got that legislation passed in Wales and is trying to get it passed in the UK generally. Ecuador has a constitution that defends the right of the forests, and many natural features now have legal rights or legal representation. And so I drew on those strands to create my ministry for the future, which was I postulated would be an arm of a subcommittee of the Paris Agreement, because that Congress of the Parties has in their originary document the right to set up standing committees. So this was, but again, as I said at the start, I pull strands out of the present and imagine that these will be the ones that flourish in the future, because I would like to have some factual basis, some sense that these are not just castles in the air, but are emergent strands of human history that I'm trying to write about.
And you have, as leader of your ministry for the future, quite a remarkable character, I thought.
Our Mary Murphy, yes. Well, I'm interested in, well, how can I say this? The bureaucrats and diplomats and technocrats, there's a group of people who are not precisely scientists, but they have expertise. They perhaps organize the efforts of the scientists, and it's important work, but it's often unremarked or disparaged. But also, it's very hard to make this into fictional characters and plots. Fiction's plots tend to be about the individual and not about teams. And the moment that you get into a bureaucracy, the story immediately gets lost in the weeds and it's hard to find. So for multiple reasons, I thought a character like Mary Murphy would be an important one to make the key character, because our experts, and I'd like to briefly say that the word elites is a bad word because it mixes together experts trying to get us out of this dire situation and bad actors trying to drag their feet and hold on to their privileges in the current order. And so holding on to the status quo, you might call all these people elites, but they're on two different teams of people with a lot of agency. So the experts have some agency some of the time and need to deploy that in order to try to get us through the century. So for multiple reasons, including the way that middle-aged women are doing incredible work all around the world and not actually making it into Hollywood very often. For multiple reasons, I wanted to write about Mary Murphy.
Well, I have a good friend who runs an annual gathering in Berlin on creative bureaucracy. And I kept thinking of that initiative in the context of Mary Murphy.
Yeah, well, that's a great idea. That's truly an oxymoron, creative bureaucracy. But on the other hand, it's got to be true, right? Because within these, it's almost like the law itself. The law is supposedly an algorithm and rigid, but human beings have to work the law and make it work. And it's the same with bureaucracies.
I want to talk about some of the issues which come up in the book. And the first is about what you and I take the point about you being a reporter and bringing and gathering together this information, but the tragedy of the time horizon, how we find it difficult to think about people in the future. Tell us a little bit more about that.
Yes, it's becoming a kind of a philosophical / economic topic. We're both grounded in our material lives and in the things we can see in our present life, and also at the same time highly imaginative creatures who spend a lot of time in the past and the future and now online, dispersed across the world, essentially global citizens, and in a situation where to a certain extent everybody knows everything. And that creates a vast present, and possibly it adds to the problem of trying to hold it in your mind that there will hopefully be hundreds of generations to follow us. People will say, well, there have been maybe 400 generations of humans since the end of the Ice Age, 10,000 years ago. 400 generations, well, that's only 10,000 years, but hold it at that. 400 generations to come, that would mean that the number of humans on the planet right now multiplied by 400 is some stupendous, more than 1 trillion humans, they all have the same lives as us. It's just that there is a time lag between us and them. They'll all have human DNA, human consciousness, and they will all benefit from being, living their lives in a biosphere that is healthy. In fact, their own health will be crucially buttressed by the health of the biosphere that supports them and is like their extended body. So we're at a peculiar crux in human history. This generation has the fate of the next 400 generations in its hands, because we can get into a good relationship with the biosphere, is sustainable and just over the long haul. But if we don't, we have a mass extinction event, and that is not something that future people will be able to recover from. You can't bring back extinct animals. Every once in a while, people will talk about this, passenger pigeons, mammoths, but these are sort of either exceptions that prove the rule, or else they're demonstrations that it can't really be done, and you're talking about some kind of a fix-up. Once extinct a species is gone and all of the big mammals are endangered, a future world, even if humans are managing to survive themselves, that doesn't have all of our cousins, will be a damaged world. And so we're at a strange crux point in trying to dodge that fate.
And the Ministry for the Future that you have looks at both humans and animals, doesn't it?
Yes, I've been thinking a lot about this. It has been derided in certain anthropocentric circles, often on the left, and I'm an American leftist. I'm extremely sensitive to criticisms from the left that only people who are leading privileged, luxurious lives can afford to think about the other animals. I think that's wrong, and was a mistake of anthropocentrism. The other animals, our cousin species, are a part of our extended body. So even if it was an anthropocentric point of view that one would want to hold or held, enlightened self-interest would say that you're not healthy unless the rest of the biosphere is healthy, and biodiversity is key to that health. And then there's just the moral issue of these are sentient beings like ourselves, they're our cousins, and deserve our regard and deserve to have legal rights in our system, because now we hold their fate in our hands, which is not a good space.
Because we hold this fate, not just in animals, but also future humans, as you've mentioned. I mean, what do you think about this idea that's certainly gaining a little bit of ground here? You know, people like, I don't know whether, I think you did an event actually with Roman Krishnari about the idea of the good ancestor. I mean, do you think that's a good thing, good way of thinking about this, that we need to be good ancestors for the future?
Yes, any imaginative rubric as a kind of a lens, or say putting on a pair of glasses that allow you to see with an extra sharpness certain issues, is a good thing to try. I think since it's both natural to us to think about the future. We are the planning species. We have a sense of futurity. We have a sense of our own mortality. These things are unusual. But to bring that to bear on our present action, that's where any kind of ideas like Romans are good to deploy. It seems to me we need more. Paying attention to one's own children, to other people's children, to pay attention to the young now, especially to children, which let's just say under 10 years old. With luck, they'll be alive in the year 2100. And so people from the future are already here, and they are walking around as a kind of demonstration of helplessness, of how much they are depending on us. Eventually, they'll grow into adults with agency like ours, but right now they serve to demonstrate right in front of our eyes the helplessness of the future generations to our particular actions. So I think a child-oriented campaigns that we're seeing more and more of are really powerful way of kind of reminding us that we need to be good ancestors, starting with being good parents and then going on from there.
I mean, at one point in the book, someone talks about, getting out there, looking around, looking at people and so on, and thinking about their lives as much as your own.
Yes, this is the great existentialist project. Can you imagine that other people are as real as you are? And this is hard. It's one of the great powers of fiction. One of the reasons I love fiction is that you go through the imaginative exercise of imagining that you're someone else. In science fictional terms, you're given the power of telepathy. You can finally hear what other people are thinking, and it's very interesting. And unsurprisingly, it's quite a bit like what you would think if you were in their situation. Then also the other power is time travel. You go to other times and places, and including the future, where you can see what it's like for those people. So on the kind of sociological or anthropological sense of that, time travel gives you that. And then telepathy, the psychological experience of the other. These are crucial powers that fiction have. And even though they're fictional powers, fiction is real in our minds. So this is a really powerful instrument for trying to think through these issues.
I want to just ask you about a couple of other things before we move on to some of the solutions that are talked about in the book. The first is the issue about protest and violence, which you do grapple with in this book. I mean, over here in the UK at the moment, protesters are blockading motorways, freeways, heading into Heathrow Airport, and they're being arrested, and then they come back the next day. The Extinction Rebellion is quite a major force in this country, and particularly, I would say, in a city like Bristol and so on. Talk us through those issues and how you've addressed them.
Sure. I would say immediately that my novel, The Ministry for the Future, is not a good instrument for thinking through these issues because it imitates, both on purpose and by accident, the chaos of our real world. What I mean by that is, on purpose, I wanted to show that there will be people so angry that they will do violence against other humans, which is almost always counterproductive, but they'll do it anyway out of their anger. And we would be best off if everybody in the world felt that they had dignity and a chance to thrive in the world system, that's the only safe system. So that anger drives a lot of people in my novel, because if we don't cope with the climate disasters, the people at the sharp end of the stick are going to be suffering badly, and a huge amount of anger is going to be unleashed against the people that they believe are not doing enough. So, but I myself am a middle-class American pacifist, wouldn't want to recommend violence to anyone. And my novel is not quite schizophrenic, but it is it's confused as history itself on these issues. So not a good thinking instrument. I would recommend a book like Andreas Malm, How to Blow Up a Pipeline, a contemplation of what do citizens of the developed world owe to the rest of the world and to future generations in terms of physical resistance to the slow violence of the fossil fuel industry and of those people who can persist in destroying the biosphere. And could that be at the level of sabotage, at the level of civil disobedience, like people blocking a freeway, like people perhaps breaking stuff, but not hurting people? So sorting out the ethical and moral issues of how do you resist in a system that is wrecking the world is better served by other sources than my novel, which is more like a case study or a giant mess where you have to de-strand things.
And to be fair, you do say at one point in the book, people have to find their own, solutions to in the most appropriate way for them, really.
Yes, and I worry that the book, in describing acts of violence, functions looks as if it's endorsing that violence. And how could it not look like that? Because it describes things. And then also the book is describing a long-term best case scenario. So it looks as if these actions are actually adding to the best case scenario rather than detracting from it. I'm uneasy about how confusing that can be. And I can only say that, as a novelist, I felt like this stuff is going to happen. Therefore, I have to represent it to be honest. But as a citizen of today, I'm intensely worried.
The final issue I just wanted to briefly talk about with you is the question of democracy, and what the Ministry for the Future is looking to develop advice, guidance, whatever, long-term solutions, which is often difficult when you face re-election every 4 years or 5 years, and you find it's very difficult, possibly in fact, to bind a successor government to you. What's your thoughts on this in terms of democracy and longer term thinking like this?
Well, I live in a democracy and I believe in it, but it's a work in progress.
Yeah.
It's aspirational that it be a democracy. It isn't obvious that the so-called democratic part of government in the U.S. isn't a kind of a false front over an oligarchy because of the incredible power of money to sway people's minds. Often I think that it's maybe better to talk about political representation. Do you feel that you have good political representation? And that way you finesse the problem of China, of 1 billion people in a different system that will disparage democracy as being mob rule or chaos. I think that democracy is a matter of collecting a working majority to express to your representatives that the representatives have to do what the working majority wants to do and not squiggle out of it by some legerdemain and some legalisms in order to support their moneyed backers. That's our project. But political representation all around the world is suspect and partial. If you ask anybody, and indeed this is an interesting question in Europe and also therefore the UK after Brexit. In Europe, you have your national governments as well as your regional governments, but then you have the EU. Well, how democratic was that EU and is the EU now? How good is the political representation is the better question. Do you feel like your representatives are expressing the will of the working majority? And that question can be asked in China without getting into the problem of their party system, which is also to say the solution of their party system to their own particular historical circumstances. You don't get into an immediate judgment that has been created by rhetoric in advance. So let's talk about good political representation all across the world. That's a pressure applied by people to their representatives to do the right thing as they understand it. And there you need the scientists, you need the experts in all fields, the bureaucrats, the technocrats, the engineers, the doctors, to tell you what might be best practices, and then try to get your representatives to legislate those best practices. So it's convoluted, and it's not ever going to be simple, because there's so much information out there, and everybody has their ideology, their imaginary relationship to the real situation, as my book makes clear. We all have one, and you will only ever get a working majority. And then can that working majority do the right thing? So these are my thoughts on political representation.
And that's the kind of debates and solutions I think we're looking for. I mean, the book is packed full of ideas for what we do, and I just wanted to go through just a few of those now. And there's an incredibly important section, I thought, when you have a series of representatives of different countries, from Argentina to Zimbabwe, talking about some of the good things that are happening in their country. And one thing that's always struck me about this whole debate of the people we work with in Bristol and so on is most of the solutions there. Science will develop, of course, and new things will be discovered, but a lot of the things that are talked about are here already. I mean, do you think we're just, is the future here now and we're just not making the right moves to implement it?
Well, no, that's not the right way to put it. The solutions are here. The money is here. So, but the future is always tomorrow, and we create it by what we do today. So I guess what I would say is good things can be done now if we arrange to pay ourselves to spend that time to do it so that we can make a living at it. So this brings us back to political economy and to the bad fit between capitalism and survival. Um, because if you think of capitalism as an algorithm that uses the highest rate of return and the idea of profit as its one and only deciding mechanism, then you realize that it's a bad one. It's a kind of a Ponzi scheme. The future generations are cheated by it, and we are in terrible trouble. So in inventing and instituting a successor to that bad algorithm of plain capitalism fast enough to do the job is a wicked problem, and that's what we're involved in. The technical solutions on all fronts, the human solutions, and as you pointed out in that chapter 85 of my novel, the human organizations are already existing to do the good work, but people need to live, which is to say to house and feed themselves in a system where you need to get paid to do these things. So that's where you come back to the political economy. How can we arrange to pay ourselves to do the good things rather than the bad things?
And some of the things you talk about in terms of economics and finance in the book, things like things we've debated here, in fact, modern monetary theory, the role of the banks, how we finance cities in the future. Again, there are ideas there, aren't there, which will help deliver, the notion that, as you talk about in the book, of enough being a fundamental human right.
Yes, after I finished the book, I found out that there is an organization of all the central banks, or 89 of them, and the biggest ones, called Network for Greening the Financial System. If no matter what political economy we're in this century, you have to imagine that money is going to continue as a medium of exchange, a storage of value, a sign of social trust. So, okay, money, it's backed by the state and it's created by the state. These cryptocurrencies are a false lead. Those are just private contracts or speculative bubbles like tulips. And the Bitcoin and related private cryptocurrencies are useless. We need money, real money, fiat money, created and backed by the governments of the world, the central banks of the world. And at that level, you can imagine money being created and designed to be spent in its first go-round, in its first introduction into the world, on decarbonizing projects, on doing the good biosphere work. And then it would circulate into the general economy in the usual way of money. But that first spending of it devoted to decarbonization is, I feel like, one of the best solutions that's been offered to get us through this crisis. It's called carbon quantitative easing sometimes. And it's a major feature of my novel because I do believe it's important that we figure out a way to pay ourselves to do the good work. I don't think you need to introduce anything more radical than Keynesian economics. It's a version of Keynesianism adapted to our present emergency in the same way that Keynes invented it to deal with the post-World War I world order, where it wasn't taken up, where the Depression, where it was taken up, and Bretton Woods for the post-World War II order, where it was somewhat taken up. These Keynesian principles are simple as pie. We're in a mixed economy of government and business. At certain points, things are so dire that government has to take over the direction of the economy, and business needs to be told what it should do and paid for what it needs to do to get through the crisis. So what I'm reporting on, I could say, oh, I advocate that, but really I'm a science fiction writer, I'm a novelist. What I'm reporting on is people who are advocating that as the best solution that we have at hand for the overwhelming problem that we're facing. So modern monetary theory is, I think, merely an elaboration or a reintroduction of Keynesian thinking into a world that spent 40 years down the rabbit hole of neoliberal capitalism, where you were in some kind of a Milton Friedman, Friedrich Hayek type libertarian neoliberal capitalism, which has proved its shortcomings in spades in these last 40 years. It's been a disaster on many fronts these last 40 years. So now it's back to Keynes.
I think it's interesting, when we've been doing a lot of work about what happened in the Second World War and the creation of the post-Second World War welfare state. And you had things like Bretton Woods. You had in this country the Beveridge Report, which transformed the lives of millions of people. It still is in a way with our National Health Service. But you also had the UN plan. A lot of these things were planned in the midst of this incredibly brutal war, world war. And yet we're now in a, not in a world war, but we're in a world crisis. But we don't seem to be able to plan well some of these future initiatives that are needed.
Well, I think that we're in the process of doing that. First, when you're in a war and bombs are dropping on your city, then the necessity is there to organize your response to that, and your whole social life and economy have to be devoted to that defense of your life. The awareness that climate change is a similar existential danger is still coming to us, but it's getting there. And the good thing about this crisis, as compared to the wars of the 20th century, is everybody's on the same side here. There will be people who don't agree with that, don't understand the situation in the same terms, but we're not at war with other humans except in the realm of ideas to get a working political majority. Once that's gained, Bretton Woods, what the Germans call year zero, in 1945, a world political economy had to be constructed. I like to think that science fiction writer H.G. Wells had something to do with the ideas that got instituted, because everybody had been reading Wells for 40 years at that point in his stubborn utopian efforts. Through 1905 to 1945 is maybe 40 of the worst years in human history, and he was writing his utopias. At Bretton Woods, it was partly Keynes, but Keynes is also partly H.G. Wells and also Edward Bellamy and the whole left tradition of ideas for a better society that leads to social democracy. And this is really the National Health Service, or democratic socialism, as you might see in some places around the world. These different political economies were an attempt to build in the real world better systems than what had existed before. And we need that again now.
Just final point about just on some of the solutions. I mean, you talk a lot in the book about some of the scientific solutions that are around or which might be around in the future. And I just wanted to ask you about one, which is about the coming back of airships and how they might transport people around. It offers in a very significant part of your book, which I won't go into because we begin to get to the end of the novel and you spoil the spoiler alerts would have to be addressed. So, but it's that kind of technology which you help us imagine as well, I think.
Yes, I've been thinking about clean, in other words, carbon neutral or even carbon negative transport. That it's important, I think, to point out that a sophisticated civilization does not have to live like saints in hair shirts, and it's not all about renunciation. A clever technology, a clean tech that is carbon neutral or even carbon negative, could retain the pleasures of travel, the pleasures of sociability that come out of travel without the carbon burn. I think sailing ships, including for cargo, are going to happen because it's a very clean tech, well understood, very safe. And when things slow down, as that might slow down, if you're still doing just-in-time supplies, then the slowness of the transfer is irrelevant to your economy. And here again, profit is just a very, very bad measure of what's best practices. And then in the air, airships were abandoned because of the Hindenburg, et cetera. They could be carbon neutral or carbon negative, and you still get around. You would be slowed down once again. But is that really a bad thing if you're wandering over the face of the earth looking down at it, especially a half-earth system where wild animals are thriving below you? It strikes me as a consummation devoutly to be wished. We need this next step in civilization to a better fit with the biosphere. There can still be pleasure, there can still be joy, human joy, and maybe the feeling of accomplishment and of responsibility to future generations would even add to that joy, so that it wouldn't be what can I call it? Say you take a helicopter ride in order to ski down a steep snow slope in the Canadian Rockies. How can you really enjoy that? It's so painfully stupid that you can't enjoy that. Whereas if you climbed that same slope under your own power and then slid down it, the joy would be increased. And this just serves as one image of the whole process.
And then one of the most important ideas, I think, that you report on, write about, and show what might happen on this is the half Earth work that that E.O. Wilson did, who's always been a great inspiration to us here.
Oh, good. I'm glad to hear that because he's controversial
Oh, yeah.
and in the States and everywhere, but I like his work up and down. He's been an important public intellectual in American life, the equal of, say, Ben Franklin or William James. And this half Earth thing, Tony Hiss has just published a book called Rescuing the Planet, in which he shows that this is not an idea sprung full blown from the head of E.O. Wilson, and Wilson would say the same immediately. For decades now, there have been projects proposed and even successfully implemented to save landscape for the other creatures and have humanity concentrate themselves. And since humanity likes to concentrate ourselves in cities, this is not exactly a big problem, except in organizing it and orchestrating it. So that leaving a lot of the land surface and the ocean alone for the health of the biosphere is healthy for humans too. And humans like their cities anyway. It's kind of wonderful. Whenever you find a double good, like the more women's rights there are on this planet, the better off we are. So that's a moral good and an ecological good braided together. And I think the same is true of intelligent land use practices, where we leave some of the land to the wild animals. That's good for us too. And so we need to seek out these dual goods.
Now, as this is part of what we call our Festival of the Future City, I just wanted to ask you at the end of this, just to tell us a little bit about what to you is the importance of cities when it comes to dealing with these the impact of climate change in the future.
I think cities are crucial. They will need to be multiple things. They will need to be green and yet very compressed. They will need to do agriculture and transport and culture. They're the crucial human technological / social space cities. And so I'm thinking that in climate change, the greening of cities and also resiliency, this is something, okay, you're in Bristol, my city is San Francisco. Many of the great cities of the world are on the coastlines, on seacoasts. And it's not a coincidence, of course. Being on the seacoast is an advantage for trade and for life. So all those cities are in terrible danger by rising sea levels. And the more we do to cope with climate change, to mitigate and make the least amount of climate change that we can get away with, the better off all the coastlines are going to be. And indeed, there's a strand in my novel about slowing down the glaciers in Antarctica and Greenland that is, again, out of the literature, described in Nature magazine. Possibly the oil industry could be put to work pulling water from underneath these glaciers to slow them back down to the speed that they used to have. They're now going 10 times faster than they used to. They could be brought back, perhaps. That these are all civilizational projects that may have to come into play to keep sea level from going up so much higher that we get into a situation like my New York 2140, where, as resilient as those characters were, they are also generations coming after decades of complete catastrophe. And it's not clear that we would survive a decades of complete catastrophe in such style as in my earlier novel. So sea level is part of the story. And whenever you're in a city at sea level, you're more aware of it than ever. You can see what would happen in just looking around you, the disaster of a sea level being even a meter higher, much less 10 meters. So this is something to think about when you're thinking about cities, is that they are both in danger, but they are also the space where we could make the good solutions.
We're about to have COP26. What are your hopes and fears about COP26?
I'll be there as an observer and a speaker. I'm thinking that it will shine, the attention of the world will be on this issue. So it goes back to a phrase from America from the 60s, the whole world is watching,
Yeah.
a chant, the whole world is watching. The delegates at COP26, I imagine, are going to be doing their damnedest to come to an agreement that ups our game so that we can, our hopes for doing better will be articulated by the promises that we make there. There will be other people in those very same governments that will be doing their damnedest to undercut the promises made. So COP26 is kind of a marker moment, a moment of global self-awareness. Where are we? Where do we need to get to? How can we get there? And then we go back to the daily life of actually making all these things happen. And there you get back to my chapter 85, all of the organizations already existing to protect their own local biomes and ecozones. These organizations already exist. People are throwing their efforts into them at the local level. It was very important for me in Ministry for the Future to list all those organizations. It was just simply a list of good environmental organizations that have a YouTube video. It's a real list. Because my novel is about the top-down approach. It's about the people working for the Paris Agreement. That isn't to say that that's where all the solutions will come from. It just happens to be the focus of that particular novel. In fact, we need coordinated global action, but we need global action. And so every level of action, and this is why I bring it up in the cities, under the rubric of cities, the city level is where you can actually contribute as a citizen most directly. So it might be one of the crucial spaces for political action.
We're out of time, I'm afraid. I mean, this has been a fascinating discussion. I'm very grateful for you joining us. And thank you again for the book. I found it a provocative read, an education, a guide, but also a terrific novel, and which deserves wide readership. It's sometimes grim, but also ambitious, optimistic and hopeful. Just what is needed now in trying to imagine and work towards a better world. We have more events in our Festival of the Future City covering these issues discussed today. Stan, thank you for all your work. We'll watch with great interest what happens in Glasgow, and do come to Bristol at some point. We'd love to see you here if you have chance. Thank you. Thank you again, Cheryl, and thank you all for watching. Thank you very much.
Thank you all. Thank you, Andrew. Thank you, Cheryl. Thank you, Bristol. I would love to come there someday.